So the next session that we will be dealing with is also very important and also partially linked to antibiotics, and that is orphan drugs, drugs for rare and neglected diseases. And I'm very happy to have my colleague here with me, my dear colleague Jakob, young Danish Dr. Vested, my former PhD student who is now my colleague at CeBIL, and we're looking very much forward to your presentation, Jakob.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm very proud to be here in this beautiful place at the university that fostered me through my legal education, philosophical education, and my PhD. So quite an honor to stand here and talk to you today. So I have the pleasure of introducing this orphan drug project. Though it's a bit of a daunting task after two so great presentations from here, there's a lot of overlaps, as you pointed out, between this orphan drug research we're going to do and the antibiotics issues here. So, well, first a little bit about my background in research. My research has mostly focused on this concept of openness and how that intersects with intellectual property. So I've done research into basic research tools, how patents apply to them, and how this ambiguous term of openness is then enforced and put into action. Open innovation, open source, all these things that you use there. I will also take some of that knowledge onto this project because I think that the orphan drug area is very interesting in this regard, because a lot of the projects and the development in the orphan drug area is enabled by thinking a bit creatively about how to build institutions, how to share data, how to use patents in ways so you can support the development of treatments for orphan and neglected diseases. So, well, first, our current pharmaceutical innovation system relies heavily on this market-based incentives to innovation. Patents are the backbone of a lot of the innovation being conducted, also in the orphan drug area. But obviously, when you have an orphan drug where there's very few patients, this mechanism is very challenged because that you don't have the big market to support and create the financial basis for development here. So, for rare disease, or diseases that for some reason have a smaller, less lucrative market, there's a risk of innovation gaps. So therefore I think that the orphan drug area is not only important to do research in order to develop new orphan drugs, I think we can also learn a lot in the rest of the projects of the program from this, because, well, here we actually have an area where there has been done research for 30 years or more into different mechanisms that can be applied to alleviate innovation gaps of different sorts. In US, the orphan drug regulation has been in place in 1983, and in 2000, the EU, they followed with orphan drug regulation that was inspired by this initiative. So basically, the regulatory framework in the EU can provide an orphan drug designation for, well, the diagnosis, prevention, or treatment of rare diseases that are life-threatening or very serious conditions that affect no more than 5 in 10,000 people. So that's not a lot. Or it can provide some additional protection to an incentive where it's in areas where it's unlikely that medicinal products would generate sufficient return on investment. So that's the primary application areas of this. What is provided of incentives is, amongst other things, protocol assistance, easier marketing approval procedures, reduction in fees, and, above all, up to 10 years of market exclusivity. So here we have quite an experimentarium in alleviating these innovation gaps with different means and tools. Okay. If we look at the context for these new the orphan drug regulation, then it's definitely not something that has been standing still. The political, the scientific, and the economic and social conditions for applying orphan drug regulation has changed. We saw with the Zika and Ebola virus that all of a sudden in the West we found out that these conditions that usually would be hidden away in a jungle in Africa and would hear about eventually, all of a sudden in a globalized world become a very pressing issue to all of the world, and very important. The Orphan Drug Regulation and some of the tools from that toolbox were applied to promote the development and the spread of and developing treatments for this Zika virus and Ebola. So the Orphan Drug Regulation is finding new avenues of applications. There's also the challenge of, new scientific knowledge. In cancer, for instance, cancer is not only cancer, it's cancer in a particular place. With scientific knowledge, we know more and more about diseases and can distinguish between different diseases. Novo Nordisk just published an article on diabetes, and we do not have 2 different forms of diabetes, but 5. So you can see how one condition maybe slides up to many different conditions with our brilliant scientists. But that, of course, also creates a problem for designation as an orphan drug, because how do we then demarcate the application of orphan drugs? Again, back to, do we give the incentives to the right drugs to actually alleviate the problem we are helping, or are we kind of overusing this tool and providing orphan drug designation for too much, and then in the long term, inhibiting the innovation in this area, not providing the support for the really innovative drugs, but maybe more providing support for businesses that are alleviating this instrument to enhance their business for not quite as moral reasons. Then another challenge here is, of course, data. In orphan drugs, it goes without saying that you have small patient populations when you're developing your drug. So what do you do about data? You have limited amounts of data. Or actually, no, today you have loads and loads of data, but the data you want to produce for clinical trials and so forth might be difficult to conjure. How do you test and evaluate these drugs? So how can you engage and use the totality of evidence that are available to develop and to ensure that the quality and efficacy and safety of these drugs are sufficient? The use of real-world evidence and so forth are important tools in this area. But it also raises grave issues about data aggregation. How do we get access to the data? How can we collect it? How can we also protect issues of privacy and so forth, in particular in the EU with the new personal data regulation stepping into force the 25th of May, that again enhances the protection of personal data. But on the other hand, we also want access and free movement of this data that enables innovation, for instance, in the orphan drug area. Finally, there's new business models. There's initiatives such as the open source drug discovery project in India, and this picture of a malaria box that was distributed to 400 different research laboratories in order to stimulate that a big host of people started to do research development in different areas of neglected and orphan diseases. I think the orphan drug area sees a lot of very interesting innovations in business models, combining crowdsourcing, private-public partnerships, and also using the efficacy of generic producers in producing drugs. For instance, the open source drug discovery project in India combines this first with a crowdsourced discovery process, then with a private-public partnership clinical trial process, and then finally collaborating with generic producers in producing these drugs cheap and efficiently for the market and the populations that need them the most. So if we turn to the research project that we will conduct, we will look into multiple different issues. You can say the overall narrative, if we will look at the different push and pull effects that are at the market, As I mentioned earlier, then on the one hand, we have a very market-based incentivized mechanism of incentivization for innovation. On the other hand, we have a patient that, of course, needs access. So a lot of different mechanisms has been applied to create a balance for both parties here, ensuring that both markets, industry can lift this task, and patients can get access to treatment, a timely treatment for their different conditions. So as mentioned, crowdfunding, intellectual property, price competitions, market exclusivity, reimbursement systems, pre-competitive collaborations, particularly on knowledge, private-public partnerships are some of the different effects that can affect this tug-of-war competition. So the different research questions that we will touch upon will be to look at, well, the IP framework, the institutions. We will do that by, firstly, literature study, look into, well, a lot of things has been written about this, so what do we already know? We will also engage in patent landscaping. As was mentioned by the previous speaker, patents are still the backbone of a lot of the innovation in the medical industry. So we will try to do some patent landscaping and see if that can alleviate our knowledge gaps in this area. We will have a look into the intersection of, for instance, with the Zika and Ebola issues. How does this health, globalization, and law combination work together? How can the legal instruments be applied to alleviate these global health issues that we experience, and probably experience a lot more in the future, because we do travel a lot around in the world, both goods, groceries, and humans, which means that what was once maybe a rare indication in an isolated corner of the world can very fast become a global issue that we should be able to address. Then we will look into these new different partnerships and how the different actors, the patient populations, the rule makers, government, and industry, how they collaborate and what mechanism helps them enhance and develop new initiatives in this area. And finally, we will of course look into the alleged innovation gaps experienced different and try to get a deeper understanding of where these innovation gaps come from, what are their nature, what could help to alleviate them, how could we bridge these gaps and develop new treatments. So, as a final remark, as I mentioned, the political, the scientific, and the economic and social landscape of orphan drug development and regulation are evolving, and it's changing as we are sitting here and as I speak. There's a dire need to look into these issues from an interdisciplinary perspective in the many different stakeholders, the patients, industry, regulators. The research here is obviously of great importance to individuals, their families, and populations affected by these orphan and neglected diseases. However, there may also be substantial learning potential for the rest of the innovation system from the experiences already made in the orphan drug area. So I think there's a dual point here, that we both look into this to enhance orphan drug development, but also that the rest of the pharmaceutical industry can learn from the experiences we have already done in this area. With these visions for the future of the CeBIL Orphan Drug Research Program, I will thank you for your attention and hand over the podium to one of the important voices in this discourse, the patients, and Birte that represents the patient organization here in Denmark. Thank you.
Any questions concerning the orphan drug study before we come to the patients?
The question I had was, it sounded to me like the idea in the orphan drug study was to combine both the idea of orphan drugs, drugs that clinically effective or clinically useful for just a very small number of people, that concept of orphan drugs was being combined with the concept of an orphan drug for neglected diseases, which can affect, you know, a great many, thousands of people, but they're orphan in the sense that they've been left to wither.
You have an insufficient market for them somehow, not enough money in the market.
Yeah, so they're, aren't they very different, and will it be hard to combine them? And is there any thinking about treating them separately, or is the idea to try and find synergies and explore that?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I can tell our orphan drug project is not quite as developed as the antibiotic project, where you've been working on that for many years. So some of these issues we are of course considering. I think my immediate idea is for starters to treat them separately, because I think it's two different issues. One thing is to have very few patients. Another thing is to have very poor patients. So that is two different issues. On the other hand, I think with antimicrobial resistance also shows that, you know, even a drug that is actually useful in a market where there should be money, shows that this lack of investment is not only relevant to consider when you have a poor population, as is the condition with tuberculosis and malaria and so forth in some of the least developed countries. So I think that we will start out with having them separately, but keep an eye out whether there is actually some overlaps, and particularly in the antibiotic, antimicrobial resistance area.
Thank you. So now we come to very important, thank you, Jakob, a very important factor in the orphan drug discussion. And again, we have more time to discuss this when we also can come back to Kevin's question.